What a horrible Christmas to have a curse of the moon. Okay, that line sucks. Who wrote this crap? And why are they allowed to... Oh, wait. Well, they were clamoring for a new Castlevania game and they got this instead. Now, I wrote that line back in 2021, 2022, and had this video come out much sooner as intended, that would have hit a little differently, I suppose. But considering what's being done with the Castlevania IP as of late, aside from the surprise Haunted Castle revisited on the recent Dominus collection, there are a lot of instances of clamoring for a new Castlevania, but here's some DLC for a game I have no interest in instead. As such, scoffing at the notion of something like Bloodstained Curse of the Moon being the closest thing to a new Castlevania-like game, simply based on the pedigree of who's heading that Bloodstained enterprise, I find that notion somewhat silly. Perhaps even more so now because Bloodstained is something that has enough of a decent track record with 3 games under its belt that it really doesn't need that comparison outside of comparing some play mechanics here and there. If anything, at this moment, I'm really just clamoring for a brand new standalone Bloodstained game because now that's long overdue. Yes, I know about Classic 2, that could have been its own game and not just DLC tied to a much better game, I guess. I don't know, I haven't played it yet. I did download it, but anyways. This is Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, a 2018 release from Inti Creates for a whole bunch of systems, including today's subject matter, Nintendo Switch. Though this was released after the announcement and success of the Ritual of the Night campaign to fund the bigger project, Curse of the Moon was the first Bloodstained game to actually see release, as Ritual of the Night wouldn't be available to the masses until the following year, and then Curse of the Moon would get a sequel in 2020, and that's as far as the Bloodstained train goes for the time being. At least until they eventually announce a new game, which again is long overdue at this point. I'd say that about a lot of series I enjoy nowadays, and it's rather quite sad. Magical Dora P2 when you fucking have. Anyway, what we have here is an 8-bit styled side-scrolling platform game which places you in the role of Zangetsu, a hunter dude cursed by demons and he wants to kill all the demons as a result. Nice achievable goal, I think. As he ventures through the game's 7 stages, 8 whatever, he will encounter other characters, mostly the other major players in that other Bloodstained game. And he can either have them join him on his quest, leave him behind, or he can kill them and acquire some extra abilities such as an arcing aerial attack, double jump, and other bits and bobs. But killing allies is frowned upon in Curse of the Moon because then we'd have no franchise. So the game offers an option to go back in time and redo your bad decision making. I mean, how dare you kill your potential buddies? That's a bit of a dick move. Besides, you'll eventually unlock an ultimate mode that lets you keep everything, cool moves, weird friends. Have fun, I guess. Anyway, your potential allies are Miriam, the protagonist of that Bloodstained Symphony of the Night game or whatever. She uses a whip and can slide under narrow passages. Alfred, an alchemist who can cast spells but only has a sliver of health. And the last ally is Jebel, your Alucard stand-in with the ability to transform into a bat, as well as possessing a bit of a limited bat attack. I presume this takes place before the eventual heel turn. Sorry if I spoiled the movie for anybody. Naturally, one would assume this is aping the style of Castlevania 3's Spirit system, but Curse of the Moon goes a step further in that you could have multiple allies on your team as opposed to just one at a time, and each character has their own life meter as opposed to sharing the one, which is actually an improvement. This also affects the way lives work. Normally, when you die via health drainage or falling into a pit, you lose a life. Here, when you have multiple characters on your team and one of them dies, the game switches to the next available character on your team, and once your entire party is wiped out, then you lose a life and restart at a checkpoint that you passed. Honestly, this is a nice touch because not only does it give you more lives than advertised, but in a way it's a good additional incentive to invite some allies to the fray rather than doing away with them. Sure, you could get a couple extra abilities, but without the extra bodies, you have fewer chances to complete a stage before the eventual game over. And honestly, the only thing the game over does is reset your score, and if you don't care for score beyond the means of getting extra lives every few thousand points, then you could continue along your merry way unabated, either on the spot or via save functionality. of which the game gives you a generous dozenish slots for you to splurge, as it were. Much appreciated, since the game has multiple modes of play, some of which you eventually have to unlock. So yeah, Curse of the Moon's inspirations of sorts is largely based on the classic-vania era of 8-bit games that graced your Nintendo Entertainment Systems and Game Boys. That much is apparent with the graphical and audio bits. It's also somewhat apparent with the gameplay, and it is sadly also readily apparent with the controls, and that of course means that you've got some stiff jumping that you cannot control in midair, fairly limited stair controls, you could jump on but not off stairs, fun. Look, most of us love those old Castlevanias, but there was a time when that franchise had moved beyond the 8-bit era and introduced new mechanics and such that made the gameplay and control better, basically evolving what the series could have been before it moved in another direction entirely, but that's a stylistic choice. And for what it's worth, control does work and it's fairly easy to figure out, and you can rebind keys if desired, so that's something. But I'm just, whatever, it's gonna fall on deaf ears and nobody's gonna care. Curse of the Moon has about 9 levels of play, but they're fairly sizable levels with multiple paths that you could take to reach the end boss. These paths usually require an ability to access them and are another means of reaching the end of the level, so it's not completely non-linear, but it's something to give players incentive to try different things to explore as much of these levels as possible. Aside from a choice of difficulty, including some unlockable difficulty settings, the game gives you an extra couple modes earned upon beating the game. A nightmare mode, essentially a second quest of sorts, that continues the main story and also features a different final stage, and also an ultimate mode that lets you have it all. There's a boss rush waiting to be unlocked if you care for such things. There's some stuff there. Curse of the Moon adopts a similar pseudo 8-bit pixel art style that you see in a lot of these pseudo 8-bit things. Game basically looks like a higher end NES game with lots of detailed backdrops and larger characters, but fairly basic looking smaller characters, further enhanced with extra colors and animations that would have been otherwise impossible on the old hardware. The novelty on this style has long since worn off by this point, but for what it's worth, it's a fine looking game. Not at all surprising considering Inti Create's track record with this sort of thing, and they do a fine job in taking a lot of the familiar bosses and characters from the main Bloodstained game and converting it within the self-imposed constraints of this current format. Credit where it's due, when you do good stuff in this style, it looks really good. Shocking revelation, I'm sure. To go along with the pseudo-NES looking visuals, you've got the pseudo-NES sounding sound effects and chiptunes. The sound effects are, well, they are what they are. They sound like sound effects from 8-bit hardware, perhaps a bit richer in some places, but that's about it really. They're nice sound effects if nothing else, but that's about it really. The music is a highlight, and if I'm being honest, I actually prefer the tracks in this Curse of the Moon game than I do in Ritual of the Night. Maybe it's because I'm a sucker for really good chip music that has a hint of the VRC6, but there's some genuinely good moody tunes in here, and even a couple themes from Ritual get the 8-bit downgrade, so to speak, and they sound a bit better here, to be quite honest. But that's just me. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is a damn fine action game. Fairly straightforward on the surface, but does have enough depth and additional modes and bits and bobs that merit further playthroughs, especially if you're a fan of this style of action platform game. And while Curse of the Moon doesn't evoke that feeling of nostalgia for me despite ties to its source of inspiration, that didn't affect the whole package, and honestly, that wasn't needed to enjoy what I feel is just a really great throwback that doesn't entirely throw back and still feels somewhat fresh and exciting, for the time at least. Nowadays, games like this are a dime a dozen, but Curse of the Moon is still a fun time had by all. And if you enjoy the old classic Vania gameplay of the 8-bit days and want more of that, well, this is a fairly good imitation at least, but still a grand old time regardless. Well worth checking out if you haven't already. What a horrible Christmas to have a Curse of the Moon. 2. Yes, it's another Bloodstained video on Christmas Day. Go figure. This is Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2. I guess we couldn't come up with a better title. Anyway, released in 2020 for multiple platforms, including today's subject matter, Nintendo Switch, Curse of the Moon is a sequel to the first Curse of the Moon game, in which you still have the gameplay and pseudo-NES style of presentation and audio and all that. But in terms of narrative, this is kinda sorta its own thing. Again, I don't know, fresh new franchise, only 3 games, and what is a canon? It's a long tube that launches miserable balls of metal wrapped in death and despair. But anyway, Curse of the Moon has 2 difficulties. Casual, which is the easier, die as many times as you like, romp in the park, and Veteran, which is the old school ladies and gentlemen's way of playing such games. I normally go Veteran, but I dabbled in Casual for a bit just to get a feel, and didn't feel like going through another romp, so this is what you're stuck with footage-wise. Besides, you're supposed to beat this game several times to unlock a bunch of story arcs and modes and whatevers, because nothing can be simple and straightforward like the good old days this shit is trying to emulate. Everything has to be beat the game to unlock hard mode, beat the game while killing allies to unlock nightmare mode, beat the game while standing on your head on a crickety wooden chair while balancing a stack of plates on the tip of each elbow and pissing a consistent stream up into the air without actually touching the ceiling to unlock the ultra secret erotic judgment mode that only 3 people in the world have actually played or seen or something. That's where you get to do the checkpoint. Anyway, if you've played Curse of the Moon 1, then Curse of the Moon 2 is relatively familiar territory. You start a new game in control of the demon hunter Zangetsu, who plays more or less as he did in the previous game. He has a sword for a main weapon, he has the same set of sub-weapons, his jumps are still stiff, and he can only hop on stairs but not off. As you progress through the games, other characters will join the fray. 3 new faces in fact. Dominique, who has a spear that can strike upwards and downwards, along with some unique sub-weapons like a plant that spouts hearts to restore health. There's Robert, who has a gun and thus has the most reach with his attacks, but he also has the lowest HP. Finally, there's Hachi, a dog in a mech. He has no sub-weapons, but he can fly for a bit, go into a burning mode that renders him invincible for a short while, and he can smash through weak floors as well as shatter spike beds, useful for reaching alternate paths. Later modes will also feature your allies from the previous game who play as they did in that game. There's a purpose to doing the 3 episodes, or 4 technically, because episode 1 is obviously the first quest of the game, episode 2 is the second quest minus 1 character, and depending on how you beat this thing, you'll either play episode 3 or another episode that trades in your new allies for your old ones. But eventually, all this leads to episode 3 where you're collecting pieces for a spaceship that will fly you to the moon in the game's true final stage. That is assuming you're willing to stomach playing through the same 7 or 8 stages over and over and over again, which I will admit started to be a bit of a chore after a while. Curse of the Moon 2 is to Curse of the Moon 1 what Mega Man 10 was to Mega Man 9, in that it is the comfortable follow-up that sticks with what worked in the first game and adds a bit more stuff to say that they added a bit more stuff, then ramps up the overall difficulty somewhat so it doesn't feel like a total throwaway effort. That's not to say that this second go-around is a half-hearted effort, because it really isn't. The 9-ish stages you're traversing are well-crafted, almost devious little death traps that challenges those who breezed through the first game with some new ideas tossed in for good measure, as well as plenty of teases for possible alternate paths that require allies that will take a good while to join your path. The new allies that you have to play with in this game are somewhat distinct from each other, bringing different tools to your arsenal that can be useful in different ways. But you could eventually reach a point where you recruit your old allies from the previous game and they're also just as useful. Now, whether you can actually stomach playing through the same set of stages over and over again to see everything that the game has to offer is another story entirely, but then again, that was also a concern with the first game as well, so really it depends on the individual player. Control once again remains spot on, simple, tight, responsive, not much change there. The one major addition is that a second player can join the fray as one of the other characters you've recruited, so you can have some cool 2-player action on hand if you want to do that. Curse of the Moon 2 once again sports the pseudo-NES style of pixel art. Looks like something that could fit onto an NES card, but hypercharged with extra colors and visual effects that otherwise would not have been possible on the old hardware. There are some recycled bits and certain characters returning and being reused, but otherwise, it's a new looking game with some nice looking art and some creative effects here and there. At this point, there's not a whole lot I could say about this. This sort of pseudo-NES retro-charged look doesn't quite wow me as it used to, if only because we've had one game too many done in this style, and as such, it's no longer special, but Curse of the Moon 2 remains a very nice looking game in this style, I will give it that much. And of course, with pseudo-NES style graphics, you have pseudo-NES style chiptunes and sound effects. The music here maintains that same energetic, sometimes moody or thematic tones of the previous game's soundtrack, and you've got a couple decent tunes here, though nothing that really stuck with me compared to the previous game's track. This is more like the B-Tracks collection of Curse of the Moon chip tunes, a couple good ones, but everything starts to blend together and it just starts to sound all the same, but that's just me though. Sound effects are, again, what they are. They're appropriately 8-bit sounding with some additional punch when needed, and thematically appropriate to the overall style. Overall, if you enjoyed Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, then Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 will also be to your liking, as it's more or less the same type of game with some new levels and some new players to play with, both in terms of new characters, as well as a new multiplayer component that ought to be a lot of fun. It's just largely a case of business as usual, and Curse of the Moon 2, while doing enough different things to not feel like a complete copy and paste, certainly feels like business as usual. Perfectly fine game, had a blast with this one, but I think I had my share, and here's hoping the next Bloodstained title, Curse of the Moon or otherwise, veers a little beyond its comfort zone and tries for something more unique. 3 games in, I think this series has more than earned that privilege. But we'll have to see what the future holds, I suppose. Merry Christmas, kids. Enjoy your holidays. Wait, you're still here? Oh wait, I guess we could play this last one, even though it's already been up. So, anyways. Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, released in 2019 courtesy of 505 Games for PC, as well as a variety of other platforms including PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and even Nintendo Switch back when that was still a relatively new platform, is Koji Igarashi's crowd-funded passion project where a bunch of people threw money his way to make the same game he's made in some form or fashion when he was in charge of some other franchise many moons ago. And I'll say this right off the bat. If you've played any of the Igavania-style Castlevania games, then it's safe to say you've played Bloodstained Ritual of the Night long before you even bought the game. The presentation is different with a 2.5D visual style, there's slightly different mechanics here and there that are culled from past IGA works, and there's no Castlevania branding to leech off of, so there's all new lore to mold. But at its core, it's pretty much the same game you've been playing since 1997 and doesn't stray too much from the beaten path, resulting in a game that is very familiar and very consistent in quality with past works, which is what people who backed the crowdfunding campaign wanted in the first place. And give Igarashi all the credit in the world. He stuck with what he knew, he went with something he knew people wanted and expected from him, and that's precisely what he delivered. Didn't try to reach for the stars or go in a billion directions far beyond his reach, he maintained an achievable goal and achieved it well enough. The closest thing that this relatively fresh-faced Bloodstained franchise got to reaching for the stars were a couple retro-themed spin-off titles from Inti Creates as well as some guest stints in other games here and there. All of this from one campaign, by the way. One campaign. The same campaign which coined the term Igavania to describe the search-actiony style of play that has become his go-to trademark, and ultimately a term that I use in reference to his Vania output. And somehow Circle of the Moon also got lumped in there, even though Iga had nothing to do with that one, but I digress. Now, is all of that worthy of putting Igarashi and Bloodstained on some pedestal and offering worship like some divine entity because he made a game that was firmly within his comfort zone? No, not at all. I think the only people who would be disappointed in this game either expected this to be drastically different from the usual Igavania output, or they probably bought this on the Switch and thus had to deal with a number of mitigating issues in terms of the overall performance. Whether those issues have been resolved by this point, well, I think the people who bought this for the Switch would be in a far better position to tell you than I would. Personally, I went into this expecting the usual Igavania experience with some prettier graphics to fit the higher definitions of the modern age, and Ritual of the Night met those not-so-lofty expectations without a hitch. It might be a different franchise name, new characters and lore to follow and such, but the gameplay is familiar fare, And I guess we should dive into that gameplay, even though really... yeah. Ritual of the Night has you assuming the role of Miriam, a shard-binding lady who kills monsters and absorbs their shards, which gives her extra powers and abilities to explore the shadows of the Hell House, or the Hell Hole as the game calls it. They probably should just called it the Hell House, better name I suppose, but I digress. Anyways, you start off on a boat, then roam through a village, and finally the majority of the game is spent in a big old castle with all the familiar tropes with new skins. You have save rooms to save your progress, you have warp rooms to warp you to different parts of the castle, you have collectathon side fetch quests for the villagers, there's the shop to buy and sell stuff, you can collect all sorts of weapons, armors, accessories, whatnots to improve your attributes, physical or otherwise. You could gather ingredients to cook up meals for later use and resources to craft inventory items such as weapons, armor, accessories, and even other shards. Yeah, so the big gimmick of this latest Igavania outing, because all these games need some sort of gimmick to distinguish them, is the shard binding ability, in which Miriam absorbs shards gained from enemies or stationary containers, and this ends up granting her extra abilities, whether it be different sub-weapons she could use, passive upgrades, companion familiars, or just other special abilities. There are 6 types of shards you could absorb. Conjure shards, your sub-weapon type, manipulative shards, enabled by pressing or holding your right bumper, usually a special ability of sorts, directional shards, another sub-weaponish type that you could aim and shoot with the right analog stick, passive shards, basically stat enhancement, familiar shards, a companion basically follows you around and helps you out a bit, and finally, skill shards, essentially the relic stand-ins that give you extra abilities like double jumps and such. Shard binding is what I feel is essentially another take on the glyph system from Order of Ecclesia. Both Miriam and the walking sandpaper that is Shinoa absorbs monster powers in pretty much the same fashion, but also feels somewhat derivative of the tactical soul system from the Blank of Sorrow games, or with the different types of shards that you have to collect. Shard binding goes a little deeper because you could upgrade set shards to improve their effectiveness, either by collecting more of the same shards or using ingredients to enhance their grade. Yeah, shards have a rank and a grade, and I don't know why you couldn't just have one or the other. This seems needlessly convoluted. Much like collecting furniture for an empty room that gives you absolutely fuck all as a reward. But at least the fetch quests and collectathons in Bloodstained will reward you something for your efforts. So that's something, I suppose. There's quite a bit to do for those who want to go for that sort of thing of things to do, and subsequent patches have added other things to the fray. Additional playable characters such as the sword-wielding Zangetsu, or one of the bosses called Bloodless, a boss rush mode, and even a classic mode molded after one of those old-school games similar to that other franchise you've probably already played countless times, and can play currently via the currently available anniversary collections, so it doesn't feel quite as special, but we'll touch on this later down the road. There's also a DLC Iga's Pack expansion pack that adds an extra little bit, but I didn't get that one, so I can't comment on it. You apparently fight Iga as a secret boss fight, but honestly, I don't know why I'd want to. He did nothing wrong. Maybe some other developer dude who claims to be a king or something might have been a better candidate for this mode, but whatever, I digress. Yeah, so I'll go out on a limb and say that Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is perhaps Igarashi's best game as far as his signature Igavania search action style is concerned, and a large part of that is due to it being a proper console release as opposed to being something restricted to handheld limitations or something that was just thrown together for the online multiplayer things. Again, this is not a game that reinvents the wheel so much that it refreshes it, and the important thing is that Ritual feels like a new experience, even if it doesn't necessarily play like one. Beneath the surface, it's all familiar fare with maybe one or two slight twists, but nothing you haven't played before, and if this is your first foray into this style of play, then you're getting a worthy introduction into the whole search action, open-ended action RPG-like adventure game thing. We really need a better genre name. Just as we need a better way of getting shit beyond all this grinding, where the drops are minuscule in either shards or items and the boosts and leveling up are somewhat minimal, which has always been an issue with these Igavanias, but you definitely feel it here. My guess is they really want you to dive into the whole crafting thing and combine various items to create other items. Except you need to gain other items, and this involves either accomplishing given tasks from the villagers, finding said items out in the open in parts of the Hell House or the Hell Hole or whatever the fuck you call it, or the time-honored tradition of grinding, which is going to be a thing if you want to try and get certain items, no matter how many luck enhancements you equip on your person. Other than that, this is a totally fine game. Some variety across the board in terms of offensive and defensive options, as well as foes to fight and things to do. All the familiar tropes associated with Igarashi style and stuff are present and accounted for, and control's pretty slick for the most part, with everything on your gamepad having some sort of function, which might seem daunting at first, but really isn't unless you're Zangetsu, and his right analog powered chain hook gimmick is a bit of a tricky bit at first, but you eventually get the hang of it. Maybe. And there's little winks, nods, and Easter eggs thrown in for good measure, referencing other titles, including some choice voice actors being brought in, and references to other characters from that other series, if you want to dig deeper, or not. The one thing I will say is that the divorce between Igarashi and the Castlevania franchise is probably the best thing to happen to the formula, because we gotta come up with some new shit for this new world. Foregoing the usual 2D sprite-based pixel style of his previous efforts, Ritual of the Night is presented in a 2.5D format where everything is made with polygons and stuff. And for what it's worth, it's a pretty spectacular looking game within this format. The character models and animations look pretty crisp and smooth in motion. The various levels are certainly a sight to behold, from the most ordained of shiny shrines to the grungiest of dungeons. The perspective is somewhat consistent, no shifting camera angles or awkward zooms unless it's for cinematic purposes, such as certain boss battles, which are typically done well. I like the little bits of customization you could apply with Miriam, from the simple changes in wardrobe based on your equipment, to the hairstyles you could change around later down the road. If something like this had been done during the PS2 era, for example, it probably would have looked like crap. So doing this during this time when you had the hardware to make this style look good was probably a smart move. And hey look, the little mouths moves when the characters are talking. See, how hard is it to have your characters' mouths move when they talk? And they didn't have to, since it's like mugshots during the text bits, but still, good job. Wish some other crowdfunded project with a big name producer behind it had similar foresight, but whatever. It's better than nothing, I suppose. The voice acting is not bad for what it is. Apparently, it's a who's who of vocal talent, including a couple of the original symphony cast being included. Don't ask me who's voicing who, because I could never keep track, and honestly, I'm terrible with names in general, so whatever. But it's fine, it's passable, it gets the hokey story forward, and not much else needs to be said there. Sound effects are fine, not much to say there, pretty stock stuff. And the soundtrack, composed by the usual Igavania composer, whose name I don't recall, but I could probably slap on the screen if I can even be bothered to remember, but you probably already know her name anyway, so anyways. It's fine. Largely done in the same style of music as their previous soundtrack, so there's a nice variety of orchestral pieces, rock medleys, a couple retro-ish, chiptune-ish ditties, and some tunes being somewhat derived from, or perhaps inspired by, tunes in past Iga efforts. Surprisingly, nothing that really stands out, which is, I don't know, I mean, it's good music in general, but nothing that really sticks to mind long after the fact. I don't know, that 8-bit ditty that they used for the 8-bit room and for the classic mode, that's about it, really. I don't know. One of the stretch goal perks of the Bloodstained crowdfunding campaign was the addition of a classic mode, essentially taking the assets of the main game and using them to construct a minigame of sorts structured after the original Castlevania game from 1986 because, sure, why not? We needed another remake of that title anyway. So eventually, this mode was added as a free update, and the idea is pretty straightforward. You control Miriam through 6 blocks divided into 3 linear areas, fight enemies, acquire sub-weapons and other pickups, such as ammo for your sub-weapons and money bags for points, and eventually reach the end of each block to face off and defeat the boss to move on to the next block. You're on a time limit, of course. You have a set number of lives, and while your moveset is somewhat limited, you do have some additional abilities, such as a slide, an evasive backflip, you could jump on and off stairs, and you even have that little trick from Rondo, where you can extend the whip's range for a short bit with a precise tap of the D-pad. You're given 3 save slots, you have a choice of 3 difficulty settings, and for those seeking an additional challenge, input that famous 30 lives code, you know the one, to enable a 1986 mode that removes your additional moves and restricts your control to what would have been possible in that vintage 1986 game. Classic mode is a thing that exists. And I don't say that to mean that it's bad. For what it's aiming for, it does a fine enough job of taking pre-existing assets and remolding them into something that emulates an earlier work. And the mode itself is indeed a fun little romp if you want another Classicvania-esque adventure of the old mold with a different skin of sorts. There's a bit of an attempt to adhere to the original game's quirks, obviously the map screen minus the footsteps, big botch there, but also minor things such as enemy behaviors, the helmet things move in the exact same sign motion as the Medusas of the first game, so you could just walk by them, for example. Stage settings, other bits and bobs. Though Classic mode does reference other games, there's a fight with a doppelganger for you to overcome after all. The 8-bit chiptunes are pretty good, not surprisingly some of my favorite tracks in the whole game. And again, it's a nice little extra bit for the stretch goals and a nice tribute to that first Castlevania game. But it's too much like that first Castlevania game, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. If I want to play old school Castlevania 1, I'm gonna play old school Castlevania 1. It's not hard to come across these days, what with the Castlevania Anniversary Collection available on various platforms. At the very least, old school Castlevania 1 will run better on Switch than Ritual of the Night does because... Look, I don't mind a less than stellar showing on a weaker console as much as most people would because I grew up on PC games running on underpowered DOS machines or non-HD PS2 or Wii versions of games that were probably better served on the higher-end consoles of its day, neither of which could sniff the sales numbers of the weaker systems, by the way, but Jiminy Cricket's dick, the frame drops on this thing are absolutely miserable. Like, I could play Doom 2016 on Switch and be fine with that somehow, but this running poorly is why I decided against doing a Switch review. I like the game, but not enough to endure a lesser version of it. So yes, classic mode, extra bit, that's it, that's all. And then there was this thing they added later on that... So somewhere along the way they decided to make another classic mode, this one dubbed Dominique's Curse and taking place immediately after the final battle of the main game. So I guess this didn't need a spoiler warning? Anyway, you play as former main villain Dominique and must scour Limbo to reclaim your lost power and such to return to the land of the living. You do this by seeking out the 4 Dukes of Hell and defeating them to unlock the gate that will lead you on your way out. There are also hidden pages to uncover and sub-bosses known as hunters to defeat, which affect the ending you get, of which there are 3. Naturally, judging by the Classic 2 label, Dominique's Curse is modeled after Castlevania II Simon's Quest, except with slightly deeper gameplay, smoother day-night transitions, almost, level design that's more in line with more linear Classicvanias, hints that are somewhat helpful as well as those that are not, and some actual bosses with some actual stakes. And no oak stakes while we're on the subject. My first question is, why isn't this its own thing? I get classic mode not being its own thing because that's a minigame of sorts, that's a bonus perk of sorts, but this is paid DLC that didn't need to be paid DLC. It could have been its own thing. Was there not enough meat to make this its own game rather than piggyback on Ritual? Hell, if anything, making it its own game rather than trying to ape the style of the Castlevania sequel with a questionable reputation would probably have been more beneficial because, again, this is reminding me of a game that I'd much rather be playing right now. Now that having been said, Dominique's Curse is fine, I guess. I like the idea of controlling the fallen villain trying to reclaim their lost power as a story idea. I'm not a fan of how she controls. It's basically Castlevania 2 with Castlevania 1 style jump control where you jump stiffly and drop from a great distance like a rock. The jumping in Simon's Quest had a much softer fall, by the way. The whip attack feels a bit off at times, it's hard to explain, but it doesn't quite have that same snap as the older games did. I do like that the game offers hints that a demon may be offering bum advice in this town in the form of red text and a cackling demon clip, and that all your conversations are kept track of in your inventory screen. I like that different merchants require different forms of currency, and you could exchange the two. Navigating the fortresses, the game's equivalents of mansions, are a pain in the ass though. The lack of a proper map function doesn't bother me since this is supposed to be classic. But why are there death pits like it's a linear platforming level? Simon's Quest had pits in the form of bodies of water that you fall into and die, but these were always at the bottom of the maps, not on the fucking top. Especially if I know there's another room underneath said pit. But hey, at least they're boss fights, right? And unlike some other Simon's Quest tribute acts that I've played, these are done properly. You beat a boss, you get a thing, and you're one step closer to the final battle. Works well enough. I do like some of the chip music in this thing. I thought that was done well. I like that the inventory is more fleshed out here, so that in addition to choosing sub-weapons and relics to use, you can also stock up on consumables like potions and such. You could also purchase extra lives up to 9 where you start with 2, which saves you from getting a game over and having to lose half your earnings to continue from the last point you died in. That's the sort of thing that feels like an improvement on the old formula that this is based on. Dominique's Curse takes a couple hours to beat and features multiple endings, and despite some issues I have, it is a nice Simon's Quest tribute act, but I don't know. This feels like something that was half-assed and passed off as a love letter when it could have been a more fleshed out game, possibly a full-blown sequel, which would be nice right about now, rather than trying to cosplay as a much older game. That's really my biggest takeaway from Classic 2. Please do me a solid and don't make a Classic 3, yeah? We already have the Dracula's Curse tribute act, it's called Curse of the Moon. Thank you. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is an Igavania by Igarashi. That should tell you everything you need to know, especially if you're familiar with the man's contributions to the Castlevania series, which were largely made along that same style. It is the same type of open-ended action-adventure, search-action, side-scrolling platforming thing with the same formula of multiple unlockables and/or patchable modes and characters, and the same kind of tried-and-true gameplay with a new coat of paint that isn't far removed from the old coats. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, it doesn't offer anything new or different beyond the new universe it inhabits, and it doesn't do anything that you haven't seen before in this style of game. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same game you've been playing since 1997 when it was called Symphony of the Night. And there is a small comfort in that, because if there is anything that can be said about these Iga-helmed Igavania games, it's that it shares an aspect with classic 8-bit Mega Man, and that is consistency. All those games, no matter the content, no matter the platform or external skin of sorts, share the same consistent core gameplay that has always held up quite nicely. It is easy to pick up and play, a challenge to overcome in whatever means you feel fit to do so, and when you're done with the main game, there's always extra side bits you can play around with for that added value. For some players, consistency often equates to staleness and stagnancy, but for others it's knowing what to expect and knowing those expectations will be met. Anything after that is just icing on that familiar cake. Ritual of the Night is consistency with plenty of icing that keeps getting added. Lots of side characters, lots of extra modes and things of that nature, all of it wonderful and or functional in its own way, most of it entirely superfluous, but at the core of it all is a game that for all who are fans of the man's work should know what to expect and be completely satisfied with it. And if you want to call Ritual the true successor to Symphony that has been awaited for decades, you can certainly make that argument considering it's a game unhindered by the limitations of handheld technology, nor is it a completely throwaway downloadable multiplayer thing comprising almost entirely of recycled assets. And if this ends up being the pinnacle of Igarashi's body of work, I could think of worse notes to end on, and this isn't it. And I'm hoping that it isn't. These past few years saw a lot of the older Igavania works re-released onto modern platforms to be exposed by a potential new audience, either those who have played these in the past and are looking to revisit old memories, or those who have never touched a single one of these things and want to see what the fuss is all about. All these games play great because they maintain that consistent quality gameplay throughout, and Ritual of the Night is sort of the highest evolution of that formula, which probably explains why there hasn't been another Bloodstained entry since Curse of the Moon 2, and we're merely content in updating the existing title with extra bits. So what's the holdup? Is it a matter of waiting for the right time to announce a sequel in the works if there is one? Or is it a matter of just there being nothing left to say with this format? As if to suggest that this is our best masterwork and anything afterwards is just going to be a massive letdown. I suppose we'll have to wait and see, but even if that were the case, you know what? Couldn't hurt to try. At best, it'd be building on a great piece of work and bringing it to another level, or a higher level. At worst, it'll be business as usual, which, in the case of this style of game, can never be a bad thing.